Hello again. As you know, I am Eli the Computer Guy, and this is episode 338, Introduction to FreeNAS. So what is FreeNAS? FreeNAS is a completely free open source file server for you to use in personal or corporate world. So when we talk about a NAS, we talk about network attached storage. These are basically servers that are built only to store data. So FreeNAS is based off of Unix BSD. So when we go in and we're going to be looking at FreeNAS today, realize this is not Linux. This is Unix. For a lot of the geeks out there, this is very important, but for most of you, it's not going to matter a whole lot. As I've talked about in other classes, although Unix and Linux are in fact different operating systems, they essentially use the same commands and you interact with them in the same way. So when I go in today and I show you the Unix permissions look like Linux permissions. Therefore, if you know anything about Linux, you should be fine. So this is a GUI operating system that we are going to be dealing with. So using FreeNAS, one of the reasons I like FreeNAS is because you can use it as a GUI. You do not have to use it simply from the command line. But I will warn you, as tech professionals, this is a real server, and in the Unix, Linux world, you really need to know the command line. The more you understand the command line and how to use commands with the command line, the better you will do overall. So although FreeNAS does give you a GUI interface, you should still know the command line. So FreeNAS, basically it's this free open source operating system. In order to install it and use it, all you do is you go to freenas.org, you download the ISO image, you create a disk from the ISO image, you install that onto a computer, and then you can administer it. Now with like a lot of these Linux operating systems, what happens is you install the operating system onto a computer, and then you go to a different computer to administer the server. So as I'll show you in a minute, when you get done installing FreeNAS, just like with a Type 1 hypervisor, you get a screen full of text and you can't really do a whole bunch of stuff. The way you get the power is by going to a different computer, connecting to the server, and then you can configure everything. Now, one of the important things to remember, now that we're talking about network attached storage, is remember that when you are sharing files over the network, there are different ways to do that. So we have something called FTP, which is File Transfer Protocol. We have CIFS, which is a protocol for server message blocks for the Windows, so you can share using Windows networking. You also have UFS, and you have Apple file protocol. So one of the very important things to remember once you start dealing with these file transfer protocols is that there are different ways to transfer data, and so depending upon how you're transferring data will matter with which one of these things that you configure. So if you want an FTP server, you're going to be using an FTP client such as FileZilla. You would set up FTP. If you want a file server to share files, being able to map a network drive with a Windows computer, then you would set up the CIFS. If you're going to have Mac computers on the network, you would set up AFP or Apple File Protocol. If you're going to be getting a little more complicated, one of the things I like about FreeNAS is it also has iSCSI. So iSCSI is a protocol for being able to send hard drive commands over a network. We're going to get into this more once we start talking more about virtualization. But again, the main thing that I want you to think about is file sharing. There's not just one way to do it. There's all of these different protocols, and depending on what you're trying to do, it'll matter for what you configure this FreeNAS server to do. So again, you can do CIFS, you can do AFP, you can do FTP, you can do iSCSI, you can do rsync. All of these are different ways to share and move data around on a network depending on what you're doing. It's up to you. Now, when you go to get FreeNAS, all you have to do is like I say, you just go to freenas.org and you can download the software. So basically, you just come here to FreeNAS, you go, you find the features, it has all the instructions. And all of that, and what you can do is you can then download and install FreeNAS. So again, it's completely free, it's completely open source, you can use it in the corporate world, the personal world, whatever you want to deal with. Now, the one thing with FreeNAS nowadays, just for you guys to keep in mind, is that they have implemented this thing called Zettabyte File System, ZFS. ZFS is just the bee's knees of current file systems. It is a very, very, very good file system. It's a robust file system. It has a lot of functionality. It has a lot of cool stuff. It is very important once you start dealing with data on a more enterprise environment. The issue with ZFS is that it requires a lot of RAM. If you're going to be using ZFS on your FreeNAS server, you are going to have at least 8 gigs of RAM. Now that seems a lot just for a file server, and it is a lot, but ZFS has a lot of overhead, so just keep that in mind. If you use UFS, which I will show you today, you don't need nearly as much RAM. 4 gigs of RAM will be fine for you, but the main thing to remember is if you install this with ZFS, you will need 8 gigs of RAM. So basically, when we go to install this, the first thing to think about is, depending on what you're going to be doing, you may need at least 8 gigs of RAM. The other thing for when you go to install FreeNAS is you install it onto a hard drive. One of the quirks is that it will take up the entire hard drive regardless of how big the hard drive is. So if you put in a 10 gigabyte hard drive, it will use up the entire hard drive simply for the operating system, not for storage, and you have no extra space for storage. If you put in a 3 terabyte hard drive in, it'll use that for the operating system, and you won't be able to use any storage on it. So the main thing is when you install this, you're going to install the operating system onto one hard drive, and that will only be used for the hard drive, the operating system. It will only be used for the operating system. It will not be used for storage whatsoever. So you have to put at least 2 hard drives into a FreeNAS box in order to have storage. Because if you install the operating system on one hard drive, and you only have one, well, then you don't have any storage. You have a working server, but no storage. You have to put at least 2 hard drives into that box for it to work and give you storage. Now, a lot of times with these FreeNAS boxes, they talk about these as being embedded operating systems. Essentially, what you'll do is you'll install the operating system onto the hard drive, and then that all gets loaded into RAM when the computer starts up. So a lot of people talk about using flash-based media for the operating system. So a lot of FreeNAS boxes, you can buy small little 10 gig either SATA or IDE flash drives to simply store the operating system so that it can be loaded into RAM whenever the computer reboots. Now, depending on what you're doing, that might be a good idea. If this is a brand new computer, you don't have any extra equipment laying around, you may want to buy one of these little flash memory sticks in order to do that. For me, I know I've got at least 50 hard drives laying around, so it's really no big deal to give up a 20 gig or a 40 gig hard drive just to shove in this FreeNAS box to be the operating system. So those are some of the things that you need to think about when you're going to be installing FreeNAS. 1, you may need at least 8 gigs of RAM if you're going to be using ZFS. 2, you need at least 2 hard drives. 3 is when you install the operating system onto a hard drive. What I've done here is I've just installed it onto a normal SATA hard drive. I don't care, but a lot of people talk about installing it onto a solid state, like one of those little SSD chip hard drives, because that's all you really need. So with that, let's go over to my little workbench just so I can give you an idea of what FreeNAS looks like when you actually install it. So I'm over here at my crappy little my little workbench in my computer. I have FreeNAS installed in this ugly looking server. I have my little hard drives just hanging out here because I'm just that geeky. This box here is actually a quad-core Xeon processor. It's 2.2 gigahertz. More than powerful enough. You can use almost any processor you want for a FreeNAS box. The big thing is the RAM. The big thing is the RAM. But I've got this set up here. I've already got it installed. When you install it, again, all you do is you take your disk with FreeNAS on it, you put it in, you boot off this disk, you follow all the prompts, and you're done. It's really simple. I would show you, but you guys should be able to figure out. It's really simple. The main thing that I want to show you, as I showed you in the episode about Type 1 hypervisors, though, is that when you get done, all you get is this. You don't get any fancy graphical user interface. It doesn't really tell you what to do. You just get a bunch of text. It says console setup, configure network interfaces, configure link aggregation, create, blah, 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 blah. The main things that you would have to know on here is the console setup is configure network interfaces. So I have this set up to take a DHCP address, but if you wanted to give it a static IP address, you would have to go in here to configure that. And then other things along here, it all depends on how advanced you are. If you're just setting this up in your house, all you need to worry about is configure network interfaces. If you're going to be setting this up in an enterprise environment, you can create VLAN interfaces and configure link aggregation and so on and so forth, but that is more complicated than you need to worry about, at least right now. The main one you want to come down to is all the way down, about the bottom of the screen. There is an IP address here, HTTP 192.168.1.6. So this is the IP address of this box. Why that's important is now we will go over to my desktop computer, we will open up Google Chrome, we will plug in this IP address, and then we will be able to log into this FreeNAS box and configure it. So the very most important thing on here is this IP address down here. This is what you're going to be using in order to access the FreeNAS box and configure it from your other computer. Again, especially for newbies, this is what confuses the hell out of everybody, is they install FreeNAS, and then all they get is this, and they wonder, well, what the hell am I supposed to do with this? You're not supposed to do a lot with this. You're supposed to grab the IP address, and then you go back to your computer, and then you can do some cool stuff. So what we go over, I'm going to come back to my computer here. And so again, so that server is sitting over there. For me, it's just sitting about 15 feet away. For you, it may be sitting in another office, it might be sitting on another floor. If you have port forwarding and everything configured, it may be sitting half a world away. So the main thing to realize is that server is on the network with an IP address, and then what you do is you come back to your other computer using a web browser, you access that server using the IP address. So what we're going to do is we're going to transition. And I have Google Chrome open here. So this is the page we were looking at before on FreeNAS. Now all I have to do is I go to 192.168.1.6, hit enter, and now I am in my FreeNAS box. So this is the actual configuration screen for the FreeNAS. So the server's over here, but I'm accessing it from here using the web browser. Now when we go in, we see that we have a lot of options. We have information about the system, the network, the storage, the sharing, the services. What I will tell you again is this is an introduction to FreeNAS today. This is a real server and you can do some highly complicated things with it, but so as not to confuse you, we're not going to do a lot today. I'm going to show you how to add the volume. I'm going to show you how to add a share so anybody can access the file share either from a Windows computer or through FTP, but realize there is a lot more that you can do. I'm just showing you the very basic stuff so at least you can get started today. So when we're looking at this, up at the top we have the options for accounts. So again, with Unix, just like Linux and just like Windows, you have users and groups. Users and groups are used for permissions to get to different files and folders on the operating system. So we're not really going to go into the accounts, the users and groups today because again, especially in Linux and Unix, that can get a little confusing for people. We can go to System. From System, we can see that we have the option to add cron jobs. We can look at reporting so we can see what the system is doing. There's something called rsync tasks. Smart tests. Smart tests are where you can actually test the hard drives that are on your computers, their settings, their system information, so on and so forth. Again, this is something that you should look at, but we're not going to worry a lot about today. Then we can come down, we can look at network, so we can look at the global configurations, we can see what the host name is, we can do domains, all that kind of stuff. There's interfaces, we can add interfaces, we can view interfaces. The one thing when you're dealing with FreeNAS is we have a few menus and ways to navigate, and not all of them are as easy to see as you might think. So we have the left-hand menu here, then we have tabs along the top, but one of the things that's easy to see is right under the tabs, all these titles are also menu links too. So sometimes, honestly, I forget about this, and you get confused with where you are. So just realize under these tabs here, these are also menu links. We have link aggregation, we have network summary, we have VLANs, we have all this kind of stuff. Again, much more complicated than we're going to get into today. But then we come down and we look at storage. So storage is where we're dealing with the hard drives themselves. This is where we are going to be storing the data. So the replication task, this kind of stuff we're not going to worry about. What we're going to worry about today is volumes. So volumes are the hard drives, or where you can put data on your disks. So if we scroll down, we can look at the disks. So we can do view disks. And I have, again, I told you I have one disk in there that we can use for storage. Again, there are two hard drives on that server. One is completely used for the operating system. The other is used for storage. So we go here, we can see if Smart is enabled, we can see all kinds of weird different information. For us right now, that's not really a big deal. What we're going to do is we're going to go down, we're going to look at volumes. So volumes are where you can actually store data on the hard drive. So basically this is like a partition in the Windows world. So right now we see that there are no volumes defined. So what we need to do is we need to come down here to Volume Manager, and we need to create a volume. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a volume called Drive. So this is just the volume name, kind of like a partition name. Then it says Member Disks. Where do I want to put this volume? And then I'm going to put it on the ADA 0, the 1 terabyte. Now the one thing to realize with volumes is, again, this is going to take up the entire hard drive. So unlike partitioning, where you can chop one hard drive into 4 different partitions, when we do this volume, basically you have to take up the entire hard drive. The next option you get is the file system type. Again, there's UFS, Unix file system, or ZFS, the zettabyte file system. I would say for now, go with UFS. The reason is it doesn't require as many resources. It doesn't require as much RAM as ZFS. Again, ZFS is much better at the end of the day. You get a lot more options. But again, for you guys just playing around with this, I would say just go with UFS. So now all we do is we click and we add the volume. So this is like adding a partition to this drive. And so we need to add this volume in order to create shares for the volume. So first what you do is you go in, you make sure you have a hard drive, then you make sure that you create a volume, and then once you've created a volume, then you can share that volume using CIFS, which is the Windows file sharing, AFP, which is Apple File Protocol, Apple File Sharing, or FTP, Standard File Transfer Protocol file sharing. But the main thing is that we have to create this volume first. So now we're looking at the volume. So the volume is called drive. The path, this is just a normal Unix path, is root, mount, drive, the amount used, the amount available, the size, the status. So this is our volume. So now that we have our volume, we can go down and we can create shares. So for today, all I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Windows share. Oh, whoops. Wait a minute. Before we create the shares, almost made a mistake there. Before we create the shares, once we create that volume, we have to add the appropriate permissions to the volume. Again, this is a Unix file system, so we're dealing with Unix permissions. So in order to access that volume in order to modify files on that volume, to be able to execute things on that volume, you need the appropriate permissions. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to give the permissions of 777. What 777 gives is complete access for anybody onto that particular volume. The reason is again, when we start dealing with Unix and Linux file permissions, it can get a little complicated. So right now I just want to open it up completely so that anybody can access this file share and not have to worry about the security or the permissions. So what we do is, now that we've created the volume, so we have this volume here, what we're going to do is we're going to go down here to change permissions. We're going to click on that. In here, we're going to say who the owner of the volume is and the owner group of the volume. Right now, all I want you to do is I want you to go here and I want you to check off all of these boxes. So the owner has read, write, execute permission. The group has read, write, execute permission, and other has read, write, execute permission. And then you're going to hit change. So all of these boxes should have a check mark. Now, I want you to understand, because I know there's a lot of faux security geeks out there all screaming at me right now saying, Eli, never do 777, because that gives free access to anybody to that file share. Again, once you start worrying about security for your NAS server, then you should start worrying about file and folder permissions. Right now, I am simply trying to teach you enough to get this box up and running. So as I always show you, the initial way I show you anything has the least security possible, so I can show you how to get it up and running. And then once you see that it works, then you can futz around with the security and do target hardening on the server. But right now I'm opening it up 777 for that entire volume so that people can access it and you don't have any issues. So now we've created the volume, we've done the permissions, all 777. So now we're going to go down and we are going to create a Windows share. So what we do is we go down and we highlight sharing. And that gives us the AFP shares, the Unix shares. The main ones that we're going to be worrying about today is Windows CIFS share. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a Windows CIFS share. And here is how we create a Windows share. So I'm going to create a share called share. There's a comment. I don't worry about the comment. Then we go to path. What I'll do is I'll go to mount and I'll go to drive. So the path is going to be to that drive volume that we've created. Then I go down, export read only, browsable to clients. Yes, you want to make it browsable to clients. Inherit owner, inherit permissions, allow guest access. This is going to be one of the important ones you have to remember is check off allow guest access. That means that people will actually be able to get into the folder. If you don't allow that, people won't be able to get into the folder. And then all you do is going to click OK. So make sure you put the name of the share that you want, the path on this FreeNAS. So basically you're doing the path to the volume. Then you go down and make sure you check off allow guests, and then you click OK. Would you like to enable this service? So I'm going to show you this in a second once we deal with FTP. But remember, all of these different file transferring protocols require different services. So you can turn on and turn off services on this FreeNAS server. So since we are configuring Windows file sharing now, we want to enable the service. So now we say yes. This is the service section. So it shows that CIFS, this is a Windows file sharing, is enabled. So now that Windows file sharing is enabled, I can open up just a folder on my Windows computer. So I'm at my Windows 7 computer. Up here, what I can do is I can go to the IP address of that FreeNAS server, 192.168.1.6, and when I hit enter, oh, that wasn't quite right. Hold on. So what we do is we do / 192.168.1.6, and we hit enter, and that is what will get us into this FreeNAS box. So now we are in the FreeNAS box, so we're on the network, 192.168.1.6, and now we see the shared folder. So I can go into the shared folder, and now this is my network share. I can go in here, and because I changed the permissions before, I can do things like create a folder, and there we go. So now this is the file share. So the server's over there, using the web browser, I configured everything, so now within Windows, I can access that file share, 192.168.1.6/share. I can now access that file, add files, add folders, so on and so forth. So that is all you have to do in order to create the Windows file share. Now, the other normal file sharing that you're going to be doing is FTP. FTP stands for File Transfer Protocol. Now, for whatever reason, FTP is not under sharing, it is under services. So if you want to set up FTP for this server, you go to Services, and then you highlight and click FTP. So FTP, this is what allows you to use FTP, a service like TinyFTP or FileZilla. So you go in here, you look at the port, you can tell it how many clients can access it, how many connections it wants, how many login attempts, so on and so forth. We're going to do allow anonymous access, and then we are going to do browse. So the path that we're going to be doing is, again, we're going to be selecting drive. So the allow anonymous access means we'll be able to access this drive anonymously. We don't have to give a username and password. And then the path will send us to drive. And then we go down, allow local users and groups, depending on whether or not you want to. And then that's it. The main thing here is right now, allow anonymous access and then the path. Then all we're going to do is we're going to click OK. Now, what we have to do though is we have to go and click on this link called Control Services, because we have set up, we have configured FTP right now, but if you try to go and use FileZilla, it's not going to work. And the reason is because the FTP service has not been turned on. So SIFS is a service, iSCSI is a service, FTP is a service. So once you do all the configurations, you have to make sure the service itself is on. So where we're going to go is we go to Services, Control Services, we go over here to FTP, and then we turn it on. So once it's turned on, now we can use a client such as FileZilla to be able to access that FTP share. So now I'm going to bring up FileZilla. So this is just normal FileZilla. You can download for free, and we go to 192.168.1.6. and we hit Quick Connect because we set this up to be able to do anonymous, right? So now here with this FTP client, we are now in the server. So this is that test folder that we created before, and we can go in, and right now I can do something such as create a directory, and I can create a directory called Bob, and I can click OK. So now if I open up my my Windows file sharing, I go 192.168.1.6. Make sure to do the //. Now we go to share, now we go to test, and now we go to Bob. So now, with that FreeNAS server, I have configured it so I can do Windows file sharing and FTP file sharing. Now basically, depending on what you're doing, you may start adding other services. Again, Apple file sharing, rsync, iSCSI, so on and so forth. We will have more classes on that in the future. I just want you to make sure that you understand how to get this far. FreeNAS is an awesome server for you guys to be using. Again, most of my business clients, when they needed a server, they really just needed some place to store their data, to share their data. So this is completely free. So instead of them spending $600 on a Windows Server license and then all the client access licenses that go with that, you can simply set up this little FreeNAS box and it's done. Again, even with 8 gigs of RAM, you can go to Best Buy right now, and for like $500 you can buy a computer with 10 gigs of RAM. You can throw FreeNAS on it, and that is a server that will do what most of your clients need. The other important reason that I'm showing you FreeNAS now is, again, I'm going to be showing you more stuff about virtualization, type 1 hypervisor virtualization. In order to do the more complicated things, you need access to iSCSI. So iSCSI is a file transfer protocol that allows you to connect to storage over a network as if it is a local hard drive, and that is one of the things that this FreeNAS box can do for me. So if you want FreeNAS, you just go to freenas.org, you download it, you copy it to it. You copy the ISO to a disk. You install it on the computer. Once it's installed, it'll give you the IP address. You come here to your computer. You go to the IP address, whatever it is. Then what you need to make sure that you do is you go in, make sure that you configure the volumes. So you actually create a volume. You go down to Volume Manager, and you would create a volume. Once it's created, you change the permissions, again, for Linux or Unix. Right now, I'm going to tell you to do 777, so that means all of these boxes get checked off. Once that is done, then you can go down and you can start doing the sharing. So you go to Windows, Shares, you can add a share. When you do, you create the name, then you do the path, then you do Allow Guest Access, then you hit OK, and you make sure that that service is running. If you want to do FTP, you come down here to Services, you go to FTP. Again, you plug in the basic information. Right now, to keep it completely open, I would say do Allow Anonymous Access, or do Allow Anonymous Logon. Again, you do the path to the volume. Then you click OK. And then once you've done that, make sure you then go to Services, where we are at now, and then turn on the appropriate services. Again, if you don't turn on the FTP service, it won't work. But that's all there is to it. So I just showed you how to create a FreeNAS file server for Windows sharing and for FTP, file transfer protocol sharing. Right now this is completely open, so if you put this on the network, anybody can send data to it, anybody can pull data to it. There are permissions and all that stuff we can configure later, but again, that stuff gets really complicated. Let's get you guys at least to this point, and before we get any worse, I suppose. So yeah, that is all there is to the introduction to FreeNAS. So this was episode 338, Introduction to FreeNAS. Go download FreeNAS, start playing with it. Again, when you create the volumes, if you go with UFS, you only need 4 gigs of RAM for the server to operate A-OK. If you go with ZFS, Zettabyte file system, then you need at least 8 gigs of RAM on your FreeNAS server, or it's just not going to work. It's just not going to do very well. And yeah, and you know, as far as things like the CPU goes, any decent CPU will be fine. Don't worry about it. The main thing with this is that you need enough RAM. And again, as I told you before, when you install FreeNAS, the operating system, that's going to take up an entire hard drive. In order to put any storage on the server, you're going to need to add additional hard drives in order to create additional volumes, to create additional storage. So yeah. So I'm Eli, the computer guy. I enjoyed teaching this episode, and look forward to seeing you at the next one.